Well, an extraordinary day here. An aide taking over the backdrop of Downing Street to defend themselves, nudging the Prime Minister's own press conference further down the day. This would not be happening unless the government thought this entire story was hurting them. And what Dominic Cummings did to try and deflect that was to defend his actions, not apologise for them. He took a few swats at the media. He denied some elements of the media stories, in particular the idea he'd taken a second trip up north. But a lot of those fundamental elements were left there intact. He didn't want it to look like he'd had a nice time in the northeast of England. He said these were not comfortable country cottages he'd been staying in, but concrete blocks. As you said, he made that trip. He accepted he'd made an extra trip, 30 miles under lockdown, to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight before making the long journey back to London. At one point he said the regulations are clear about what I did was OK. You can't just sit there in my circumstances. That will rub some people up the wrong way. But amongst Tory MPs that I spoke to after yesterday and the Prime Minister's, by general accounts, pretty shaky press conference, some of them are just beginning to change their opinions, saying, well, maybe he's done enough to survive. Not all of them. One of them saying this is absolutely not the end of it. But another one, a minister as it happens, saying, I think he's done enough to survive, but at great political cost to the Prime Minister. Here's how Dominic Cummings defended himself today. One cabinet minister said any of them would have been thrown under a bus by the Prime Minister by now. But here was Boris Johnson lending his garden, the sacred terrain reserved for Prime Ministers, to help Dominic Cummings mount a defence of his conduct in the face of public and political demands that he be sacked.
Sorry I'm late.
And that was the only time the word sorry would be uttered.
The regulations made clear, I believe, that risks to the health of a small child were an exceptional situation, and I had a way of dealing with this that minimised risk to others.
A solitary protester at the back of Downing Street blew a vuvuzela as Dominic Cummings made his defence.
I thought the best thing to do in all the circumstances was to drive to an isolated cottage on my father's farm. At this farm, my parents live in one house, my sister and her 2 children live in another house, and there was a separate cottage roughly 50 metres away from either of them.
Relations he thought might look after his son, though in the end they weren't needed.
I can understand that some people will argue that I should have stayed at my home in London throughout. I understand these views. I know the intense hardship and sacrifice that the entire country has had to go through. However, I respectfully disagree. The legal rules inevitably do not cover all circumstances, including those that I've found myself in. I thought, and I think today, that the rules, including those regarding small children and extreme circumstances, allowed me to exercise my judgment about the situation I found myself in.
He said he hadn't sought the Prime Minister's permission before driving 260 miles north of his home, but had told him a few days or so later. He'd known about your excursion north for about a month and a half, and he didn't ask you anything until yesterday.
So, regarding the first part of your question, yes. I mean, essentially what I've just told you guys is what I told the Prime Minister yesterday, and I went through all... Yes, he asked me about it on... Was it Friday night that the story broke, I think? I can't remember if it was Friday night or Saturday morning.
It was when the story broke he was interested.
Saturday morning.
It was when it was public he was interested. It was when it was public he was interested. He didn't ask you anything before that. He just knew.
So... As I said before, we spoke about it in the week after it happened. I can't remember what day, but in the days following, we were both in bed ill. We had a few conversations on the phone.
You've been up since then. He knew for a long time.
Well, so as I said, I spoke to him about it then. I told him about that. But to be honest, that was like the least of the things we were thinking. Like, my movements were not part of our conversation.
With tracing perhaps kicking off in a big way in the coming weeks, people will be asked to isolate. The public health message will never have been more critical, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Do you think public adherence to those instructions will be weaker or stronger as a result of your recent activities?
Well, I hope it won't affect it, and I hope that that now that people know what actually happened, and that some of the false stories that have all been circulating and driving a lot of people, understandably, mad and about it, then I hope that people will realise.
You've stood up the central story in this allegation that you drove a very long way from home when everyone was told to be at home. If there was more leeway in these instructions than we thought, why didn't you tell everyone about that?
Well, with great respect, Gary.
Who else has driven that distance?
I'm trying to answer the question. With great respect, it's not just a simple matter in the regulations. The regulations describe various exceptional circumstances where it may not be possible to follow the rules. It doesn't say you must stay at home in all circumstances. It says that there are some circumstances in which you won't be able to follow these rules.
People will be staggered to hear you say that when the message was so clear, stay home. Is the fact that the Prime Minister can't do his job without you?
The guidance says, if you are living with children, I'm reading out the actual guidance. If you're living with children, keep following this advice to the best of your ability. If you've got a child that's 4 years old and neither of you can look after him, the guidance doesn't say you've just got to sit there. So I think as I've said, I think I behaved reasonably in all of these given all the circumstances and the different things I had to try and weigh up.
He categorically denied reports there had been a second trip north after returning to work in London.
What is your message from Conservative voters who voted this government in less than 6 months ago, a lot of them for the first time in the North East around Durham, who want you out of Downing Street and want you out of this government?
What's my message to them? Well, I think I've made mistakes in how I've dealt with this, all sorts of things in government. I don't think I made a mistake about these 14 days that are in question, and I would I would stress to people that they should not believe everything they read in the newspapers or everything they see on TV.
He said he'd never offered his resignation to the Prime Minister. This had been an attempt to make sure no such thing was ever needed. Early signs were that it moved some opinion amongst Tory MPs. Number 10 now waits to see whether it calmed the angry mood amongst the wider public.
Well, the 30-minute journey between Durham and Barnard Castle has been central to the discussion about whether Dominic Cummings broke the rules of the lockdown. Earlier today, as you heard from Gary, he claimed he made the trip to test his eyesight after he had problems seeing when he had symptoms of COVID. Jane Dodge reports from Barnard Castle.
It should have been the busiest day of the year in Barnard Castle, but the annual Carnival Parade has been cancelled because of lockdown. A lockdown that Dominic Cummings helped put in place. This afternoon, he finally admitted he was here on Easter Sunday with his wife and son. Forced in part by the testimony of a local man, Robin Lees, who recognised him that day.
This is where Robin Lees said he spotted Dominic Cummings, his wife and son. He said they were walking along this path and then got into a car. He told me, I just thought this wasn't right. We were meant to be following the rules. And he confirmed that he's now made an official complaint to Durham Police.
77-year-old Barry Bowes lives across the road. He's been self-isolating for the last 2 months.
I've adhered to all the rules that have been set down by the government, and I've taken all the advice and haven't been able to see family that I wanted to see, haven't been able to go anywhere, I've had to self-isolate. And this chap disappears from London and drives all the way up here and thinks that he's beyond reproach.
Do you have concerns for your own safety?
Well, who knows what he's brought into the town with him, and apparently his family have had the virus, and who knows who he's bumped into, where he's been, what he's touched, we don't know.
The waters were muddied by conflicting versions of the role played by Durham Police. They said they'd spoken to Mr. Cummings' father about a potential breach of the lockdown by his son, who was staying in part of the house. At first, the government said no such conversation took place. Then they said it had, but was about security. Now the police have backed that version.
Our officer gave no specific advice on coronavirus to any members of the family, and Durham Constabulary deemed that no further action was required in that regard.
The acting police commissioner for Durham has called for an investigation to clarify the facts.
We've seen a plethora of information come out over the last couple of days, and I think it's time for the force to take stock of all of that, to establish the facts, to demonstrate to the people of County Durham that we have a grip on this, so that as we continue to police the revision of any lockdown guidance, we do it with the full confidence that the public who we serve have confidence in us.
So has Mr Cummings' perceived breach of lockdown led to others following suit? Half an hour's drive from Durham, people on Seaton Carew Beach were still social distancing. The Coast Guard, though, said they'd spotted people here from as far away as Rochdale. We found one man visiting from London. He's backing Mr Cummings.
He didn't have in his mind to go drive around and spread all the virus, isn't it? He had to look after his 4-year-old child, so he had to go. He had to do it, right, for the sake of his child, and it was all safe.
It's just so wrong, isn't it, what he done? It was so wrong, and he's been telling us, and we've all been doing what we've been told to do.
What should happen to him?
Oh, I think he should resign, definitely.
A day by the sea certainly provides a little respite from lockdown, but the man who defined the message has now confused many about its meaning because of his decision to come to Durham.
Well, in the last few minutes, the Prime Minister has been speaking at his delayed coronavirus daily press conference, and he's announced there that from June the 1st, outdoor markets and car showrooms in England can open, and from June the 15th, all other non-essential shops can then open in England again. No word yet on his special advisor, Dominic Cummings, and his reaction to that extraordinary press conference, but we will bring you that as soon as we have it. But now I'm joined by the Conservative MP, Andrew Bridgend, who, as a Brexit supporter, has described Dominic Cummings as a serial winner and believes he was right to stay in his post. Andrew Bridgend, you must be pleased that he seems to have saved his job, but has he irreparably damaged the government's attempts to get the public to obey the rules to the letter during this pandemic?
I think Dominic Cummings came out and gave a very reasonable response. He's a man who looked, he's used to working under pressure, but he's certainly been under a lot of personal pressure over the last 3 days, probably the most he's ever experienced. I think he gave a reasonable argument, and obviously a responsible press such as yourself should be reiterating the government's messages, something that he is well aware of because he's been key to drafting them.
Well, I appreciate what you say about the press, but shouldn't he also have been sticking to the letter of the rules? And weren't both of those lockdown trips actually a breach of those rules?
Well, I think Dominic Cummings knows the rules, and
Did he abide by them?
He took decisions not only to protect others from harm, which he minimised by his actions, but also to protect his own family. When I first heard this story broke a few days ago, I was pretty angry, like most of the public probably are now, and many of my constituents are still emailing in, and I made my concerns known to the Chief Whip and Number 10, saying that if Dominic Cummings has travelled more than once, his position would be untenable. That he was so many miles from his job. He is a critical worker, he's a key worker, and he was looking to return after having had the virus. I suffered it myself. It's not pleasant at all and debilitating. If we'd put another key worker in that position, say we were considering a doctor who'd had the virus and was wondering whether they were up to a 5-hour drive back to work, and they tested their driving ability, I don't think we'd be having this conversation, Kathy.
But do you, in your heart of hearts, believe that he drove to a well-known beauty spot on his wife's birthday simply to test whether he could drive?
I think it would be a good precaution. I have to drive three hours from Parliament back to Leicestershire. That can be a tiring journey. If you haven't had COVID-19 less than a week before.
But he could have driven round the block. Did he need to drive 30 miles on his wife, or nearly 30 miles on his wife's birthday to a picturesque market town? Do you believe that?
Well, that's the decision he took. We can argue about whether that was the right, or he should have gone down a main road and driven on a dual carriageway. No,
I'm asking if you believe him.
Do I believe him? do I believe that that was the whole reason he went there, or was it that was the decision he made, having suffered from COVID-19? And I can assure you that recovering from that does affect your decision making severely, inhibits you. That was a decision he makes. He makes lots and lots of decisions all the time.
But it blurred his judgment potentially.
For those people who don't agree with Dominic Cummings, don't like the Conservative government, don't want Brexit, no excuse or explanation he can give will be sufficient for them not to call for his resignation. But they were calling for his resignation before this story blew up as well, weren't they?
Very briefly, would you have liked him to apologise today?
Yes, I would, but I'm not sure that's the character of Dominic Cummings that I've ever met. In fact, that was the most human side of Dominic Cummings I've ever seen. I think you might see a slightly chastened and different Dominic Cummings as he continues now. That might be a better thing for all of us.
Andrew Bridgend, thanks very much for joining us. Well, Dominic Cummings is the arch strategist and the Prime Minister's right-hand man. Credited with winning the Brexit vote and helping secure Boris Johnson's election victory, he's often described as a maverick. But he is also the advisor who came out of the shadows and is currently centre stage, some might say for all the wrong reasons. So who is Dominic Cummings and how did he become one of the most influential men in British politics?
Dominic Cummings has emerged blinking into the sunlight of the Downing Street Rose Garden after years spent in the shadows. His political career started more than 20 years ago, but it was his abrasive style working for Michael Gove at the Education Department which forged his reputation.
Is it all lovey-dovey now? Between Mr. Gove, always was.
With former Prime Minister David Cameron describing him as a career psychopath. A talented one, though, credited with helping the Vote Leave campaign win the Brexit referendum after he conjured up the Take Back Control slogan, his role immortalised in a Channel 4 drama.
350 million quid and Turkey again. 350 million pounds and Turkey again and again. Show no mercy, all right?
When Boris Johnson became Prime Minister last year, he stunned Westminster by appointing Cummings his chief advisor, handing him unrivalled power.
What he wants is the best brains around him, and Cummings has obviously got, whatever people think of him, a particularly big brain.
Publicly, the Cabinet sometimes appear fearful of criticising him.
Are you and your colleagues a bit scared of him, though?
No.
You stand up to him, do you?
I have a total agreement with the Prime Minister.
He's openly belittled them, likening them to a children's cartoon character.
Comment on the Cabinet reshuffle.
PJ Masks will do a greater job than all of them put together.
He's made himself indispensable to the Prime Minister, masterminding government policy from the Brexit withdrawal agreement to the coronavirus lockdown strategy. Boris Johnson appears to have concluded he simply can't do without him.